Boldwood presents A Story to Strangle For, written by E.V. Hunter and read by Emma Powell. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to Hopgood Hall and our inaugural Journalistic Awareness course. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alexi Ellis, and I was, until a year ago, an investigative journalist on the Sentinel. Alexi had never had a problem with public speaking, or with poking her nose into places where it wasn't always welcome. Self-assurance was a necessary requirement in her chosen profession, along with a thick skin and a determination to get to the story ahead of the opposition, no matter what impediments were placed in her path. Today, though, in a situation that she ought to be able to handle with her eyes closed, she felt inexplicably nervous. And there was a good reason for that. She was laying her reputation on the line in an effort to make the course a resounding success. She'd called in favours from her old colleagues to make it so, especially from her former boss and ex-lover, Patrick Vaughan. If all went according to plan, then the publicity would go a long way to cementing the reputation of the boutique hotel in Lambourne in which Alexi held a minority shareholding. In the wake of the questionable publicity the establishment had garnered following recent unfortunate events, it had to be. Seated round an oval table in Hopgood Hall's annex, a table covered with a crisp white cloth bearing refreshments that no one had yet touched, the 6 faces of her delegates stared back at her with friendly curiosity. The people who'd gained places on a course that could have been filled 10 times over were an eclectic mix of ages and backgrounds. Deliberately so. They all looked at Alexi with rapt attention, hanging on her every word, putting her in mind of a bunch of students on the first day of term, nervous but keen to impress. Their ages ranged from mid-20s to mid-70s, and as far as Alexi was aware, none of them had met before. They all had note-taking equipment in front of them. One of the older people had a tablet and hit the keyboard with agile fingers. The youngest had an old-fashioned pen and paper. So much for stereotyping, Alexi thought with an ironic twist of her lips. "We'd all be sorry excuses for amateur journalists if we didn't recognise you," a voice said. Alexi glanced at her notes. It was Peter Foreman, a civil servant with rugged features, piercing blue eyes, and a thick thatch of salt and pepper hair. He oozed. He also, Alexi knew, had her firmly in his sights. He'd been coming on to her at every opportunity, even though they'd only just met, and seemed to think that she'd be grateful for his attention. Pompous arse. "Thanks." Alexi inclined her head in recognition of the compliment. "As you are aware, you're here for 5 days because, as Peter just pointed out, you all have an interest in the journalistic process. We'll be covering the manner in which the profession has had to adapt in order to survive in the light of the social media explosion, instant news, and trial by public opinion, made possible by the aforementioned social media." "You must know all there is to know," a woman said, nodding as though Alexi's words were gospel. "If I thought that, then I wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes," Alexi replied, watching the woman's face fall. She was Emily Bairstow, 40-something, Alexi reminded herself by checking her notes. A divorcee with grown children who wanted to make a fresh start now that she had the freedom to please herself. Alexi could write the book on fresh starts and took an instinctive liking to the woman, who had intelligent, expressive eyes and understated style. "I did promise that I wouldn't sugarcoat," Alexi added, smiling at Emily. "And if anyone thinks that being a journalist is glamorous, then I'm afraid you're in for a rude awakening." "Nothing glamorous about standing outside in all weathers, waiting for some minor celebrity that no one's heard of or cares about to emerge from a nightclub. Take it from one who knows." A thick-set younger man said his piece and then crossed massive arms across his chest as though defying anyone to repute his words. His application had intrigued Alexi. A bouncer from the East End of London was the last person she'd expected to show an interest in her course, which was one of the reasons why he'd made the shortlist. "Thanks, Archie," Alexi said. "Your comment brings me nicely on to the #1 golden rule for this course." "What is that golden rule in the world of journalism?" she asked. "Can anyone tell me?" A young Indian girl's hand shot up. "Get the story before the opposition does," she said. "That's important, Rania, but not quite what I was after. Anyone else?" Several more suggestions were made. Alexi reminded herself that none of these people, as far as she was aware, seriously wanted a career in journalism. They were taking a layman's interest for a variety of reasons. Some wanted to write short stories, others wanted to contribute articles to local papers and magazines. One wanted to write an investigative novel about an unsolved crime. Several, like Emily, the divorcee, were simply interested. As the ice was broken and the residents exchanged more, Alexi let them run on. But when she raised a hand, she was immediately rewarded with silence. "The story," she said simply. "Nothing is more important than the story, and getting the facts straight." What Mrs. Housewife at number 7 said about the man who regularly knocked his wife about until he killed her simply won't wash. If, on the other hand, a witness actually saw the man behaving violently towards his nearest and dearest, that's another matter. The witness has to be able to back up his assertion with evidence. Otherwise, you'll be reduced to using the words allegedly and accused of and so forth, which isn't news at all. It's merely repeating what's already in the public domain and is likely to bore your readers rigid. "That's what the reporters on TV do all the time," a woman called Grace Weston remarked. "They simply repeat what the anchors already said." "Very true," Alexi replied, nodding. Grace, she with the tablet computer, was the oldest person on the course. In her early 70s, she looked at least 10 years younger. Her hair was shoulder length, without any grey to give her age away, and her face was surprisingly wrinkle-free. She was tall, with a figure that women half her age would likely give their right arms to possess, and there was a natural elegance about her that Alexi admired. And one of the reasons why I became an investigative journalist rather than one of the pack reporting on breaking news. As Archie pointed out just now, standing about for hours waiting for a soundbite becomes, well, restrictive. But in-depth investigation allows you to triple-check facts and brings its own rewards, Peter said, nodding as though he knew what he was talking about. Alexi didn't like the voracious civil servant, nor did she like the way he undressed her with his eyes. But she tried not to let it show. It was early days, everyone was nervous. She would withhold judgment. For now. "The purpose of this course is for you to flex your own investigative muscles," Alexi said. "For the next 5 days, you are encouraged to search Lambourne for an interesting story that can be expanded into a public interest piece for the Newbury Post. The editor, Bill Naylor, will be here to meet you all at dinner time and has promised to publish at least a part of the most promising contributions." A mutter of excitement rippled through the room. Alexi hadn't told them that their purple prose might see the light of publication, mainly because she'd only just managed to twist the editor's arm. "Think outside the box," she added. "And remember the second rule of good journalism, which I referred to a moment ago." She allowed a significant pause, confident of her audience's complete attention. For instance, Mrs. Potts winning the Best in Show for her run of beans 3 years in succession is hardly groundbreaking journalism. What's her secret? How does she eclipse fierce opposition to win the coveted prize year after year? Does she read her veg bedtime stories? Readers love quirky things like that. Peter sniffed. "Hardly Booker Prize stuff," he said. Where in a local paper, not known for its worldwide coverage, would the piece be published? Alexi asked. Who would be your target readership? "The gardening section," Grace responded, sharing a collusive smile with Alexi. "Horticulturalists would actively seek it out. Locals are the readers, obviously." Alexi nodded. "Think big, but start small and get recognised." There was a pause as Diana Horton, a middle-aged, frumpy travel agent who'd taken an active interest but had yet to speak a word, reached for the coffee pot and volunteered to pour for everyone. Diana, Alexi noticed, was the first to reach for the biscuits once the cups had been handed round. Her gaze lingered pensively on Peter's face for a prolonged moment, and she looked conflicted. Alexi was about to ask her if they knew one another, but Archie spoke, diverting her attention. "We don't have to write about vegetables, do we?" he asked, dunking a biscuit in his coffee. "Absolutely not. Use your imagination. Wander about the village, visit local businesses, and wait for inspiration to strike." "Please patronise local businesses," she silently pleaded. Alexi had visited pubs and shops, promising that her aspiring journalists would raise their profile. She was attempting to manage the damage done to the village's reputation in general, and Hopgood Hall's in particular, following 3 murders that had occurred in the past year, all with connections to Alexi and the hotel. "Well, it's obvious what's of interest," Peter said. "The murders." "Already done." Alexi fixed him with a challenging look. She had expected the question and wasn't surprised that Peter had been the one to voice it. Best to get the elephant in the room, the bait that had probably attracted at least some of her attendees, out in the open. "By me. Of course, if you think you can find a different angle, then feel free to give it your best shot." "One imagines that the village wants to play the murders down, so the local paper is hardly likely to print anything about them." Alexi flashed a grateful smile towards Grace, impressed by her insight. "Cosmo, then," Peter said, folding his arms defensively. He was referring to the feral cat that Alexi had come across beneath Waterloo Arches when she'd once visited the area to do a piece about the people living rough there. For reasons she had never understood, taciturn and sometimes downright aggressive if he took a dislike to a person, he'd proven to be a surprisingly good judge of character. He'd also stolen the show by posing for Alexi's former colleagues during recent murder investigations. Alexi laughed, on safer ground now. "You'll have the dubious pleasure of meeting Cosmo later, Peter, so I'll make a deal with you. If he lets you approach him, then write what you like about him. If you can think of an angle that hasn't already been done to death. My cat does not shy away from publicity." Alexi would bet her bank balance on Cosmo taking a dislike against Peter. "Deal," Peter replied, rubbing his hands together and winking at her. "I would suggest delving into the cases that come before the local magistrates if any of you have a desire to report on crime. The verdicts will have been handed down, but perhaps there will be an opportunity to speak to the person who's been convicted. Find out what made them do it, especially if the person was of previous good character." Several heads nodded and notes were scribbled. This is, of course, horse country, and local trainers' successes are widely reported. But how about the grooms who care for the pampered equines and seldom get to share in the glory? What are their stories? What got them into the horsey world? Alexi spread her hands. "Think local interest." Rania tugged a long plait over her shoulder. "Horses petrify me," she said. "I think I steer well clear of them." "Then you, Rania, might turn your thoughts to the time of year. We're coming up to Halloween, which is now a big deal for adults and kids alike in this country, but never used to be. What's changed? Is it a US trend that's made its way across the pond? Is there any foundation in the spiritual myth of Samhain?" "That's not local stuff," Peter objected. "What, people don't celebrate Halloween in Lambourne?" Archie asked before Alexi could. "A quicker way to national fame, if one can explode the myth," Grace pointed out with quiet dignity. "What did I miss?" All heads turned as the door opened and Jack Maddox strolled through it, looking like he'd just stepped off the cover of a gents' magazine. Although he and Alexi were an item and cohabiting, her heart still stalled when she saw him unexpectedly. And even when she didn't, he appeared to have caught the attention of every woman in the room, who undoubtedly appreciated his physical attributes as much as Alexi did. Predictably, Peter scowled at him. The civil servant seemed to have an inflated opinion of his own attractiveness and didn't appreciate the competition from a man who had nothing to prove in that regard. "This is Jack Maddox," Alexi said. "Ex-Met Police, now local private investigator." "Hi," Jack said. And welcome one and all. Jack will be on hand to offer help and advice on any police procedural queries you might have before writing your piece. Or pieces. You have 5 days and can write as much as you like in that period. I will be here to offer guidance if you want me to. If you'd prefer to keep it to yourself until the final full stop, then feel free. You've given us a lot of scope and plenty of food for thought, Diana remarked, helping herself to the last biscuit. You forgot to mention Patrick Vaughan's involvement, Peter said. That's why I'm here. The local rag is all very well, but I'm confident that I'll be able to interest Patrick in my style. Think big, that's what I say. Alexi shot a glance at Jack. They had argued over Patrick's participation, such as it was. He would appear at the final night's party and cast a quick eye over the participants' efforts, the carrot and stick approach. Alexi was pretty sure that he wouldn't be taking on any of her wannabes anytime soon, but his name was nonetheless a draw. Jack had argued that he'd only offered his services because it was a way to keep close to Alexi. Whilst that might well be the case, Jack failed to accept that he had nothing to worry about in that regard. She found such a self-assured man's uncertainty about her commitment to their relationship mostly endearing, occasionally frustrating. She most emphatically did not need his protection. Exactly, Alexi smiled. I shall be interested to see what you come up with. But for now, I shall leave you all to settle into your rooms. The annex and its facilities are for your exclusive use this week, but of course, you are free to use the public parts of the main hotel as well. Get to know one another, exchange ideas, work together if you have similar ideas. There are no rules. Lunch will be served in an hour. By a handsome chef? Emily asked with a mischievous smile. Perhaps he'll be the dish of the day. Everyone laughed. Don't encourage Marcel, Alexi advised, laughing along with them as she and Jack stood up. Marcel, their temperamental chef, was a ladies' man through and through, but the only abiding love of his life was his creative food, about which he was passionate. If you're thinking of interviewing him, I'd advise against it. He received more than his share of publicity when he was briefly suspected of murdering a contestant in the cookery contest staged here, she added, thinking it better to get that one out in the open too. And now only talks to journalists about his food. Shame. Grace smiled. You're not making this easy for us, are you? Alexi returned her smile as she headed for the door. Where would be the fun in that? She asked. Well done, Jack said, taking her hand as they There was a strong wind gusting and rain threatened, again. They'd had more than their fair share of it recently. I haven't done anything yet, she replied, other than give in to pressure and host this course. Still can't decide why I did. You know why, Jack replied, squeezing her hand. Alexi nodded, because it was true. Jack had been all for exploiting the murder rate in Lambourne by holding murder mystery weekends, but Alexi had vetoed that idea, thinking, but not saying, that it was tacky. Besides, they had to do something different to restore the reputation of the hotel and fill rooms. They were in agreement on that point, and this seemed like the obvious way to go. Jack had insisted that Alexi's solid reputation as a journalist would have people flocking to join the course, and that had proven to be the case. She was flattered, her ego stoked by the response. But she had insisted upon keeping it small, just 6 participants this time. If it went well, she'd consider expanding the numbers for future courses. Hello, you, she said, bending to scratch Cosmo's flat ears when he appeared out of nowhere with Toby, a terrier half his size, trailing faithfully in his wake. I hope you don't intend to terrorise my guests, although I suppose I wouldn't mind if you hiss at Peter and put him in his place. The civil servant, Jack asked. Yeah, he's going to be a problem. Not sure why he felt the need to come, given that he thinks he already knows it all. Jack laughed. You'll keep him in line. Jack opened the door to the hotel's private kitchen, domain of owners Drew and Cheryl Hopgood, Alexi's close friends. She'd run to Lambourne with Cosmo, her tail between her legs, when her position on the Sentinel had become untenable. Her lover and political editor, Patrick Vaughan, had known that redundancies were in the offing but hadn't given her the heads up. He tried to persuade her to take a lesser position, but Alexi knew her worth and was having none of it, forcing a generous settlement out of the paper instead. Patrick had assumed that country life would bore her and that she would return to London, and to his bed. He'd been wrong on both counts, and, murders notwithstanding, Alexi had found both contentment and a man she adored in this most unlikely of locations. She had also invested in Hopgood Hall, encouraging her friends to expand, but her efforts had been rewarded with not one but 2 murders taking place on the premises. In both cases, she and Jack had unveiled the identity of the killers, neither of whom had any connection to the hotel. Even so, once the initial influx of guests curious to see the scene for themselves had waned, Alexi was surprised when bookings didn't immediately tail off. Naturally, since the restaurant was booked for weeks in advance, that was likely true. Even so, the profits from the restaurant alone weren't sufficient to keep the old house maintained and the business ticking over. Something had to be done to fill the rooms year-round and keep the place in people's mind for reasons other than violent death. "How's it going?" Cheryl asked, looking up from playing on a rug with Verity, her daughter who was just a year old. "It's going," Alexi replied, grimacing. "Relax." Drew walked into the room. "The only thing that will be murdered this time is the English language, and I dare say it'll recover from the odd misplaced semicolon." "Easy for you to say," Alexi replied, smiling as she took Verity from her mother, barely conscious of sticky fingers digging into her hair. "I appreciate that you're doing this for our sake," Cheryl said, taking Verity back when her head lolled on Alexi's shoulder. "I know you have a lot going on, and I want you to know that I appreciate the sacrifice you're making." Alexi felt bad for complaining when she still felt responsible for the damage that had been caused in Lambourne only since her arrival in the village. Her head told her that she had nothing to feel guilty about, but her conscience was having none of it. She had overheard more than one person muttering comments about her being a Jonah, about there being no place in the country for townies like her, who didn't understand local customs and traditions. Polly Pearson, the middle-aged owner of a long-established B&B, was Alexi's main detractor, and Jack insisted the source of the gossip. Alexi barely knew the woman and had not, as far as she was aware, done anything to offend her. It wasn't as if Hopgood Hall was likely to take her business. The 2 establishments were at opposite ends of the market. "Don't worry," Alexi smiled her reassurance. "I'm a woman. Multitasking goes with the territory." "Well, even if this course is the unmitigated success that I expect it to be," Drew said, "don't feel you have to do it again if the participants drive you bonkers." "I can out-bonkers the lot of them," Alexi quipped. "How's the outline for the book coming on?" Drew asked. Good question, and one that Alexi didn't really have an answer for. After the first murder that she and Jack had solved shortly after Alexi's arrival in Lambourne, she had accepted a large advance from a publisher to write a full-length book on the case. It had shot to the top of the non-fiction charts. Everyone wanted to read about the murder, it seemed, especially when a well-known public figure proved to be the guilty party. The proceeds, along with her settlement from the Sentinel, the sale of her London flat, and an inheritance from her late mother, had left her awash with funds. Funds that she'd utilised to help her friends extend their... Perhaps Polly Pearson was right to brand her a Jonah. She had declined the opportunity to write a book on the latest catastrophe, preferring not to draw more speculation in Hopgood Hall's direction. Instead, she'd accepted an advance to write a collection of in-depth exposés about cases of abuse, corruption and violent crime where the perpetrators had evaded justice. Stories that she'd written for the Sentinel, but which had not seen the light of publication because the paper's legal team weren't willing to risk being sued. An opportunity to lay out the facts and highlight the loopholes in the legal system pounced upon by expensive defence barristers was too good to resist. "Still in the early stages," she replied in answer to Drew's question. "But I have to say that I'm quite excited about the project." "The pen is mightier than the sword and all that," Jack remarked. "It's a balancing act. Social media is a very powerful weapon, but can be misused. I really don't approve of the way that reputations, lives in some cases, can be destroyed on the back of rumour and innuendo. At the same time, I know the people I'm intending to write about got away, literally, with murder in some instances, thanks to the vagaries of our legal system. The police know it too, and are beyond frustrated at the hoops they have to jump through to prove their guilt. Alexi shrugged. We're talking ruthless individuals who think they're above the law. I simply want to set the record straight. I've seen a few mentions online. Your publishers are getting their PR in gear, Drew said. You'll have half the criminal fraternity wetting themselves. Alexi laughed and shook her head. Sticks and stones. Nothing I say can hurt them, at least insofar as they can't be banged up because they've already been tried and acquitted. Their reputations are another matter, though, and I won't lose any sleep over exposing them for the scumbags that they are. Quite right, Jack agreed. The public hate injustice. Alexi's name carries some weight. She's known as a serious journalist who checks her facts, not someone out for a cheap thrill. So perhaps the authorities will sit up and take notice. It's high time some of these scroats who think they're untouchable are named and shamed. True. Drew nodded. Anyway, we'll wait for Cheryl to put Verity down, then we'll have lunch. I take it you have to go back and hold your delegates' hands shortly, Alexi? Yep. Once they've had lunch, I'm going to set them loose. She grinned. Don't say you haven't been warned. Drew laughed. How much harm can a bunch of wannabe writers do in a small village? He asked. Chapter 2. The participants set about their assignment with enthusiasm over the next 2 days. Jack was glad to see Alexi gradually relax, despite Peter Foreman's. The man was an irritating know-it-all who fancied himself as a ladies' man and had Alexi in his sights. But as she herself had told him when they talked about it the night before, she'd had more than her fair share of staving off unwanted attentions during the course of her career. Jack had sensed Alexi's abiding doubts about the wisdom of running the course, even though she stopped short of actually saying that something was bound to go wrong. She was starting to believe the local gossip, the poison spread by Polly Pearson in particular. Ordinarily level-headed, she was halfway to convincing herself that she was a Jonah. But her guilt was misplaced. Nothing that had happened in Lambourne since her arrival in the village had been her fault. But he couldn't deny either that tongues were wagging or that fingers were being pointed in her direction. Jack would do just about anything to prevent her from returning to London and that smarming bastard Patrick Vaughan. Despite the fact that she now felt at home in Lambourne, that would be the most obvious course for her to take if anything else untoward were to occur. There was anonymity in big cities, and the world's wrongs couldn't be placed at her door if she hid away in the suburbs. All her attendees were in fine form, if one overlooked Peter's determination to dominate. Jack went out of his way to schmooze with them all, putting them at their ease by sharing amusing anecdotes about his years in the Met. Bill Naylor, the editor of the local paper, played his part too, and Jack could sense that the love of his life was beginning to have faith in herself. It's going well, Jack said, as they prepared to leave her cottage on the penultimate day. If one ignores Peter, why he thinks he's God's gift is beyond me. She rolled her eyes. He obviously doesn't see what the rest of us do when he looks in the mirror. Do you know what projects they've taken on, as a matter of interest? Let's see. Emily is doing a piece on a single mum who's been threatened with eviction because the father of her kids has stopped paying maintenance and so she can't afford her rent. Archie Walton is looking into how grooms, et al., exist without any sort of nightlife, which, given his career as a bouncer, is an obvious area of interest. He writes surprisingly well. He's interviewed a few grooms and reports their responses without getting all flowery or over-wordy, which is a common mistake with amateurs. Rania and Diana have joined forces to report on integration here in a small village. Is there anything to report on? You'd be surprised. Grace has chosen Halloween. And Peter? I assume he didn't get anywhere with Cosmo. Aware that he was being talked about, Cosmo looked up at Jack through wide, unblinking eyes and mewed, making him and Alexi smile. Not a chance. I wish he had in some respects, because he's chosen to delve into the Paul Franklin. Good luck with that one. He says he wants to talk to me about something important that happened in London. To do with Franklin? Jack permitted his surprise to show. Why? She shrugged. Absolutely no idea. You think that's what attracted him to the course? The local supposed sighting, I mean. I really couldn't say. The man makes me uneasy. Alexi picked up her bag and searched it for her car keys. Why he thinks I need to know is baffling. Something about a mutual acquaintance, apparently, but he won't tell me who. He wants to get you alone so he can wow you with his charm, darling. Jack frowned. Should I be worried? We're eloping next week. She grinned at Jack when his frown deepened. If I even suspected that I'd read Peter all wrong, Cosmo's reaction to his attempts to befriend him would have reassured me. The man's a plonker, out to make trouble. Not sure why I feel that way about him. I mean, what can he do, other than attempt to monopolise my attention, which I won't stand for? Alexi's expression remained resolute. I absolutely need this course to be a success, and I won't permit him to ruin it. If he gives you any more trouble, I'll get Cassie to do some digging into his background. Everyone has an agenda nowadays, so it's better to be safe than sorry, especially after what you just told me about a mutual friend in London. Thanks. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Jack wasn't about to tell her that he'd already had a brief look at all the participants' backgrounds. Or, more to the point, his business partner had. He absolutely did not want anything else to go wrong for Alexi, or she really would be driven out of Lambourne by local hostility. And there was only one place and one person she would run to. Not happening. Having located her car keys, Alexi kissed Jack and left the cottage with Cosmo at her heels. She was headed for the hotel and her morning briefing. Jack needed to be at the office in Newbury that he shared with Cassie Fenton. Cassie, a friend of Jack's ex-wife, had attempted to take her place once the divorce was final, but Jack didn't share her feelings. They worked well as a team on investigations, though, since Cassie could make computers sing for her and nothing online stayed hidden from her for long. Cassie had thrown a wobbly when Jack got together with Alexi, and he thought at first that he and Cassie would have to go their separate ways professionally. But she'd gotten over her jealousy, and their partnership had endured. Not that Jack and Alexi were likely to socialise with Cassie any time soon, but Jack was fine with the status quo. He reached the office and was surprised not to find Cassie in her usual place in front of her computers, head down, intent upon whatever flashed up on any of her 3 screens. He shrugged, thinking, but he absolutely wasn't going there, so busied himself with his outstanding paperwork. The phones were quiet, and he managed to get a lot done. He glanced at the clock when his mobile rang, surprised to see that it was almost lunchtime. Cassie's name flashed up on his screen. "Hey, Cass, what's up?" he asked, resisting the urge to ask why she wasn't in the office. "There's a lead on your case. I assume you're in Lambourne?" "No, I'm in the office. Why?" "Meet me at the Swan in Shefford. I have a potential lead on Amy." "Okay, I'm on my way." He hung up without asking any questions, locked the office and headed for his car. Cassie did spend most of her time in the office nursing her precious computers, but it wasn't unheard of for her to venture into the field. They were attempting to locate Amy Dawson, the wife of a close friend of Cassie's who'd gone missing, so she had a personal interest in the case. The Swan was less than 5 miles from Lambourne, a popular gastropub/hotel with a terrace backing onto the river. Jack hadn't been able to uncover any connection to Amy in the area. She was from Winchester. Presumably, Cassie's online sleuthing had come up with something important enough to drag her out of the office. Jack's short journey was made longer by an accident on a narrow country road, and it was 15 minutes before he could get past it. He finally pulled into the Swan's car park. It was half full of high-end vehicles. A couple of bikes were chained up in a stand by the door. One, a yellow mountain bike, caught Jack's attention. Cassie, leaning against the bonnet of her car, waved when she saw him and walked over. "What kept you?" she asked. "Accident. Have I missed something important?" "You just miss your girlfriend," she said, looking edgy. "Alexi, you have more than one?" Jack shrugged, recalling that Alexi had planned to meet Peter there. Bill Naylor had talked about a case of mistaken identity that his paper had covered in Shefford recently, the case that Peter had taken it upon himself to delve into. The person in question had been wrongly identified as Paul Franklin, a criminal on the run who was wanted in connection with a bullion robbery at Southampton Docks that had left a man in hospital fighting for his life. Just the sort of case that a more enterprising wannabe of Peter's ilk might be tempted to investigate in his pursuit of journalistic fame, which had probably been Bill's attention when mentioning it. "What brings you here?" Jack asked. Amy was seen in the area less than a week ago. Well, not seen precisely, but she was definitely here. "How do you know?" "Her credit card was used." "That's interesting. She's been missing for a week and not used it once, which made us think she must be staying with someone. Either that or she's been used." Jack's mind whirled with possibilities as he fixed his partner with a probing look. "Her husband is your friend. You must have some idea." "Neil isn't the problem, if that's what you're implying." Cassie spoke emphatically, almost as though she was attempting to convince herself. Jack shook a warning finger at her. "You know better than to make assumptions." "I've known Neil for 20 years, she protested. "He was a vegan long before it became fashionable. He believes in the sanctity of life, all life, and literally wouldn't harm a fly." "We none of us know what we're capable of when boxed into a corner. Besides, there are more ways to intimidate than physical violence. Amy wouldn't have disappeared without a word if she wasn't afraid of him." Cassie folded her arms across her chest. A strong wind blew fallen leaves into the air and sent them whirling about in eddies. Yet more rain threatened. Her gesture was defensive rather than an attempt to keep warm, and he knew that she wouldn't be receptive to his suggestions of marital disharmony. "We were working on the assumption that she'd been abducted, but hadn't uncovered any proof to back that theory up. They aren't a wealthy couple, but if she'd been snatched for some reason other than money, then Neil would have been contacted by now. He does deal in sensitive government information." Jack nodded. "So you say. But if he thought she'd been taken in order to extract information from him, then why call us in? And why tell the police, for that matter?" Cassie let out a long sigh. "Yeah, point taken. You're still veering towards her having an affair and leaving Neil for the other man. In which case, why didn't she just tell him she was scarpering?" "Perhaps because I'm right and he's controlling or mentally abusive. Men of that ilk are very good at hiding their proclivities. Anyway, let's talk to them inside and see if we can get a handle on who used Amy's credit card." Jack started walking towards the entrance. "Let's hope it was Amy herself." Jack led the way across the car park, scattered with a rainbow of falling leaves still being tossed about by a sharp northerly wind. He entered a pleasant foyer, decorated in orange and black, and an array of spiders' webs in anticipation of Halloween, and was greeted by a smiling hostess. "A table for two?" she asked. Jack offered her a smile that usually got him what he wanted, at least where women were concerned. He heard Cassie, at his side, inhale sharply. "We're investigators," he said, flashing his identification beneath her nose, "and we're hoping you could help us." "Not the Franklin case again," she responded with a theatrical sigh. "How many more people do I have to tell?" "The bullion robbery." "Like you didn't already know." The professional smile had disappeared. Without it, Jack could see that she was older than she had. "That sort of publicity is bad for business." Bill Naylor was still a relatively young man, keen to make a name for himself as a journalist. Jack wondered if he dangled that particular case beneath the noses of Alexi's delegates because he thought there was still something fishy about the supposed mistaken identity. Amateurs asking innocent questions often got better results than their professional counterparts, Jack knew. It was a long shot, but breaking the story and taking the credit for bringing a vicious thug to justice would be Bill's ticket out of local journalism. "Actually, we're looking for a missing person whose credit card was used here last week. Can you help us out?" The woman, whose name badge identified her as Sally, looked dubious. "I'm not sure. Isn't that sort of stuff supposed to be confidential?" "Do you have CCTV?" Cassie asked. speaking for the first time. The woman shook her head. "What date are we talking?" Cassie told her. She and Jack waited as she rummaged through her computer. "No one of that name booked a room here. If her card was used in the bar, I can't tell you anything about that." Jack glanced at Cassie when she opened her mouth and shook his head. "Were you on duty on the 13th? He asked, showing Sally a picture of Amy. "Do you recognise her?" "Possibly. Not sure. Faces all look the same after a while. I don't take much notice. Too busy." "Is there anyone who would know?" Cassie asked, an impatient edge to her voice. "Even if there is, I doubt they'd tell you anything." Sally had clearly taken exception to Cassie's abrupt manner. He wished she'd keep her mouth shut and leave things to him. Cassie's decision to remain mostly in the office wasn't solely attributable to her computer skills. By her own admission, she was most emphatically not a people person, especially when she was lied to, a frequent occurrence in their line of work. "Confidentiality and all that. We were told, after the supposed sighting of that robber guy, to remain professional. I told that bloke who came this morning the same thing." "Someone was asking about this lady?" Cassie asked. "No, about the criminal. I had to get quite shirty with him." She huffed. "Honestly, some people—" "Okay," Jack said. "Thanks for your time." "What the hell?" Cassie demanded as they walked away. She knew more than she was saying. "Even if that's true, we could have got her to tell us how." "I don't know." Cassie threw up her hands. "Somehow." "Even if Amy was here, she's long gone, and chances are she didn't leave a forwarding address." "Even so." "Know when to back off, Cassie. If you're certain that there's something here, tell the police. They can demand answers." "Yeah, okay." She still seemed on edge, reluctant to let it go. Amy was her friend's wife, so she was probably... "Even so," she added, glancing at two members of staff taking a smoking break on the back terrace, collars turned up against the wind. "Since we're here, we might as well—" Her voice abruptly broke off when a piercing scream echoed from upstairs in the pub. Cassie gasped. Jack's training kicked in, and he instinctively ran in its direction. He took the stairs 3 at a time and discovered a vacuum cleaner abandoned in the hallway leading to the toilets. A woman, presumably the one who'd screamed, sat on the floor, looking as white as a sheet. Several people had emerged to see what the fuss was all about, one of them clearly the manager, but at a word from Jack, he hung back. Jack entered the gents and felt a dull sense of inevitability when he discovered Peter Foreman, Alexi's troublesome civil servant, slumped against the urinal. He felt for a pulse, but knew he wouldn't find one. Chapter 3. "You look tired," Cheryl remarked, smiling across the kitchen table at Alexi. "But really, you should be feeling exhilarated. Your course is an unmitigated success. Everyone I meet seems to be singing your praises. You've managed to be both professional and approachable." Cheryl giggled. "I think your delegates are a little starstruck." Alexi laughed and waved the suggestion aside. "Rubbish. Cosmo is the only star in this setup." Alexi's cat looked up from Toby's basket, rested his chin on the dog's back, and mewed in agreement, making the ladies laugh. "Well, anyway, whatever your secret, you're well on the way to putting the past behind us and re-establishing the hotel's standing. Not that it needs re-establishing precisely, despite what you seem to think. Bookings are steady and Marcel's reputation ensures that the restaurant is always full. Even so nothing. Stop beating yourself up over events that were none of your doing. Drew and I were on the verge of bankruptcy when you came to Lambourne and shook us by the scruff of our necks. Without your foresight, we would have gone under. Now we're even contemplating taking a holiday. I know, astonishing or what?" Cheryl added, grinning. "And we can even afford to pay for it." "Then I'm glad. You could certainly do with a break away from this place. You and Drew never stop working." Alexi stretched her arms above her head and yawned. "As the course